Hi all, and welcome to the next session on Engels. So I'm going to go quickly through the readings, and then George is going to pick up where he left off last time and finish that out, and then we'll have a discussion. Uh, so I'm going to try to talk about contemporary feminism, about Angela Davis, and some of that email discussion, not in detail. Everyone can read it if they want. Um, right. What's going on here? Get in the next page.
The Gremlin jag work, huh?
Yeah, it won't go page down. Like it won't give me the next slide.
Huh.
Why that is? It'll take it. It'll make it larger, but it won't turn the page.
Oh, so do you check those little things on the left? It doesn't change?
Yeah, that's what happens when I click it. It takes the screen, but it won't respond to the.
Oh,
Won't respond to the.
How about forward and back arrows or up and down arrows? Do those
Yeah,
do it?
yeah, no, that's what I'm trying. So just maybe just clicking on it might take it to the next one too, but it doesn't seem to work. And maybe right, let's try resharing, see if that works.
yeah.
Yay. Right. Okay. Right.
Right?
So I mean, I think I wanted to be clear that I think this is an enormously important pamphlet, even if I have some difficulties with it. And it's precisely in the title, really, right? That Engels is trying to think through the family, private property, or class, and the state, and how these things came together, for the first time in the familiar patterns. And he's looking at it as an interconnected historical process of social organization and social reproduction. And today it's hard to get a grasp of that material because they tend to be studied in different disciplines now. So you have, people who are in politics doing the state and people in sociology doing the family. And well, I'm not sure that anyone really does class anymore, but maybe anthropologists do, and and uh, and economic historians, perhaps. Um, so it's much more fragmented in ways that make it difficult to pull all the latest together. The debate has been really interesting on the email, I think. As I see it, there's two basic themes that we've sort of come to. How did male domination emerge, or patriarchy? How did that emerge historically? And how gender relations are reproduced under capitalism, and recognizing that these may not be the same questions. That how something emerges historically um, it doesn't necessarily tell you how it works now. Now, I would say that Engels' historical reconstruction is shaped by Morgan's outdated savagery, barbarism, civilization schema, It's I think that schema tends to push you in the direction of a sort of single historical moment of origin, even if Engels doesn't intend that or say that. But you get that language of like, so there was this world historical defeat of the female sex, and then after that, men are dominant, and because it had to happen, it did happen, that kind of thing, rather than it being a long and complex historical process. But clearly, we get societies organized by kinship, then we get the property relation, the rise of private property, and then of class society, and then the state emerges to manage all of that around, Engels is saying around inheritance and the division of labour and changing forms of domination. So the important thing in modern debates particularly is nobody thinks, Engels included, thinks that this is a natural process. We're trying to explain it as historical materialist when so much of this material is seen in bourgeois theory as natural. The family's natural, marriage is natural, the nuclear family is natural, and indeed class and hierarchy are natural and just emerge naturally from human nature. So, of course, Engels isn't having any truck with that. I know that George will talk about Brewer, but and he will elaborate what I just said in more detail. But I did refer to these readings. Lee Cox was an anthropologist in the 70s who wrote one of the introductions to this book by Engels, and she reinforces that idea that I just got reminded by reading her that that this is an attempt to denaturalize sex and gender and the family and these other institutions, and so how they emerge historical. So she doesn't have any time for biological explanations. But she does want to separate the questions from Morgan's outdated anthropology. And one way of doing it, there's lots of different attempts to reconstruct this and lots of contemporary debates about it. But the version I shared with you was by a former comrade of mine who wrote a PhD on it, Pat Brewer. And indeed, Sue Bull, who wrote the article that I circulated, is still active in the Socialist Alliance here in Australia. And she makes the argument that the shift happens between horticultural and plough agriculture. So horticulture, like gardens and gardening with hoes, that can be done by anybody, doesn't require an enormous amount of strength. Whereas the argument is that plough agriculture becomes the domain of men, and the cattle become men's property. I think there's some issues about that, but that's the idea, is that women get displaced from the productive work of society and get locked into child and reproductive labour, and so the labour process is central to the explanation of why women are oppressed in modern class societies. I just quickly rehearsed the debates going back to the 70s. The debates, there was liberal feminism. The perpetual opponent has always been a liberal form of feminism, a reformist form of feminism, very much in the vein of, we would say bourgeois middle-class feminism, their experience taken as universal, white women's experience taken as universal. Within that, you had the sort of Soviet Orthodox Marxism, which largely saw women's oppression as a secondary or derivative matter. Communist parties, well, here in Australia at least, communist parties are always very strong on industrial issues around women and equal pay and for women and all those kind of issues, but they didn't talk or think much about women's role in the party often, and certainly not in the domestic sphere. That was seen as sort of outside politics, which is where part of the emergence of the modern women's movement, the feminist movement, was out of the left. Women of the left saying, look, why are we making the tea and sandwiches and you're doing all the talking, right? So that's a caricature. On the other side, you had the radical feminists who sort of took the term patriarchy, but see it as historically autonomous, that it's always existed, and it might take capitalist forms or feudal forms, but patriarchy is the primary one. And there are racial theorists who do this too, that they see race as primary, and so you end up with a kind of is it? We would say we have capitalism with patriarchal social relations in it, with all the contradictions and stuff, whereas radical feminists say we have a patriarchy and we currently have a capitalist form of it, right? So it's just what you see as primary. And that led to a whole lot of debates called, dual systems then. How do you explain capitalism and patriarchy together? Socialist feminists then, tried to rethink Marxism to take more account of reproduction and domestic labor. Names, there's lots of them, but the ones that I think are particularly important was Selma James. Selma James being C.L.R. James' partner, and Silvia Federici, who's still writing about things, but was instrumental in the 70s in the wages for housework sorts of campaigns. That if housework is unpaid labour that reproduces the system, then we need to get wages. Women should be paid for the work they do at home. And Lisa Vogel wrote Marxism and the Oppression of Women. And there's a whole literature around the sort of unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism and towards a better union and all those kind of metaphors. Today, this debate, it has its roots in there, back there, but it's now really done in terms of what's called social reproduction theory. So by the 2010s, you have Sue Ferguson and Titi Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser drawing on all those debates to think about it in the context of neoliberalism, really. So how is labour reproduced under neoliberalism? Domestic labour, childcare, care work and education are all, there's a lot of pressure in neoliberalism to privatise these forms. So, that clashes with that. I put around the Fortunati one, and that one takes the next step of talking about we shouldn't treat the domestic sphere as something separate from production, which is how it's sort of typically being cast, even by Marxists. We should incorporate it because they're producing labour power, they're producing workers. So we should treat it as part of production, in effect. And however you cast it, capital clearly depends on these reproductive spheres, but it avoids responsibility for the domestic sphere where reproductive labour is treated as unwaged or private. The same way that it treats, Jennifer mentioned last week about ecology and how that fits in, and there's obviously a big literature about that, but this is another one. Like nature is treated as a free gift. It's something that capitalism depends on, but it doesn't treat it as if it has value because it can get it for free. It's treated as a free gift of nature, and so we can just come into the system as a free gift. That's standard economics, and we could see the domestic sphere in the same way. It's sort of outside of production, and anything that happens there, the labour's free, freely given labour for love or whatever, and so we don't treat it as proper labour. And I'm just putting those out as examples of the different positions that exist. It's not a homogenous. We all agree. There are debates about exactly what's the best way to think about this. I do think Angela Davis is useful. I know part of this was supplementary reading, but I think it's good because it links us back to the previous section. Angela Davis is a very important figure in the prison abolition movement, but has a history as a Black Panther, as people probably know. But her book, Women, Race and Class, came out in 1981. So it's got to be in the transition from the 70s, but it was sort of capturing. And the two chapters that I did read were put on the list and read The Legacy of Slavery. So I thought it was interesting just to go back to sort of capture that link across, that slavery disrupted the separation between productive labour and domestic femininity. So that sort of white liberal view of feminism, where the main complaint was that women were stuck at home and unable to work, and assigned to the domestic sphere and a certain kind of feminine, gender that's associated with that, while men are associated with the productive sphere and a certain kind of masculinity. Slavery disrupted all of that. So Black women were not excluded from production. They were a key part of the slave production system, whatever we call that. And so it shows that women's oppression can be organised in different ways, even under capitalism. So the exclusion that white women were talking about was not such a problem for those people fighting, for black women fighting slavery. So there were different family structures. Like family structures were institutionalized in bourgeois society, around the nuclear family, but that didn't always apply in the working class, and it certainly didn't apply, like slave families didn't have the same respect and respectability that bourgeois families had. So, children could be taken and sold and so on. But reproduction clearly in the slave situation is clearly tied to to capital accumulation. So we can see, just as another example, that capitalism organises gender and reproduction differently in racial populations. So it's not just a question of how did this originate; it's a question of how it's working. Otherwise, Davis's position in chapter 13 is about the approaching obsolescence of housework, and I thought this was a useful reminder because maybe everybody here is on top of the traditional positions that Marxists took, I suppose, but I'm often struck by how little people realise what, they do know that Marxists didn't deal with feminism, apparently, didn't deal with women, only with class, but they don't seem to realise that the idea was that because housework had been assigned a private sphere, but is socially necessary, then it should be socialised. That there should be, those things that are dealt with in the private sphere should be made public and should be dealt with publicly. So public kitchens, public childcare, public laundries, to take that labour out of the domestic sphere and to free women to work in productive, in the productive sphere. So that's sort of a different take on the wages for housework question. So as a bit of an aside, my old communist friend Neville used to point out, like to point out that, of course, that the capitalists have actually got on top of this themselves, right? So instead of, it's all called barracks communism, right? That everything will be organised in these giant factories and there won't be private houses, and this was the vision was like these, grey private public kitchens, rather than going, what capital did was move in on that, and now like one third of meals are eaten outside the family home, but they're provided by private capital. Right? So McDonald's provides food, but even something like here in Australia, I assume there are equivalent institutions elsewhere, like a workers' club. There's a workers' club in Newcastle, and then you could go down to the workers' club or the Leagues Club here, and you can get a roast dinner for $10, because they're pooling the members' things, and they're still pooling the members' resources in order to give cheap meals that you can just eat at the club. And nobody thinks that's barracks communism, but it is an example of how more and more, even under capitalism, more and more of those social functions are being socialised, and especially as women are drawn into the workforce. So I think the sort of central questions are about how patriarchy is historically produced. Is it trans-historical? And some race theorists have argued this too, that race pre-exists capitalism and therefore is primary or has a bigger role, and it's been traditionally thought of by Marxists. There are questions about how reproduction is organised under capitalism. Does capitalism, transform older relations or create new ones? And what would an integrated materialist account of all this look like now if we drew on the latest research and so on? So that's my 2 cents worth. Just my quick overview. Comments, questions?
Yes.
I know George is going to disagree with me on some of this, but that's okay.
Yeah. I have some questions. I'm just trying to find a couple of comments.
Yeah.
If I can find my hand, let me put a hand up.
Yeah, right. You go, Wiley, and then George.
Yeah. Well, just a couple of quick comments. Thanks for that. Your presentation certainly sums up a lot of the debate that's taking place. Particularly, I think the thing that is, from my viewpoint, is most important is how the bourgeoisie, in terms of its ideological campaign against Marxism, and this is particularly true in the social sciences, has, put everything into a silo and essentially disconnected something that is inherently interconnected. And so that everything is discussed independent of other elements, which is the only way they can be made sensible is through their interconnection with these other elements. So that is a great victory on the part of the bourgeoisie by compartmentalizing these sciences in such a way that nobody knows really what the hell they're talking about. On the other side of that, at the same time, I mean, I've read Origin at least 10 times since the 70s. And every time I read it, I get a much deeper understanding. But one thing always comes to the fore. I am convinced that most people who criticize Engels simply hasn't read Origin carefully, and especially chapter 2. And I say that because in chapter 2, he presents the germ of everything else, and it's extremely interconnected. And he says certain things which I think people lose sight of. For one thing, he talks about patriarchy as a transitional form, as something very temporary, as something in between, and it's treated as this was universal that existed forever and ever, even among Marxists. So they miss, sloppy reading misses certain very important points that Engels makes on that one. I think the other thing that I want to comment on is similarly, the class question. I don't think people really take the time to understand the real importance that Engels is sharing with us, again, in the germ of the class person. He in that chapter, he gives us the essence of the thing. Now, obviously, that essence takes numberless forms and so forth. But none of those forms remove the essence, namely, after a certain point, the emergence of the class struggle and those attributes that led to the development of the class struggle itself. And he develops this further in his discussion of the family under the proletariat, within the proletariat. And so my point is, there's certainly a lot of good research and good studies, as Shane points out, in terms of the struggle of feminism, and there's certainly the struggle against male supremacy is a very important one, absolutely of the greatest importance. But if it's detached from the class struggle, if it's not seen as an expression of a historic and objective class struggle, then you're all over the map. And down any number of rabbit holes, and so forth. So the bottom line, every time I go through a process like that, like we're going through now, if I had to give any advice to anyone, I'd go back and read Engels and read him carefully, particularly with chapter 2. And don't try to read the rest of them, unless you understand fully what he's trying to say in chapter 2. And so that's just sort of like my takeaway on this thing. And again, I repeat, the fact that some of these even wrong-headed debates are brought up forces us to rethink our position on a number of things. But even in the process of that rethinking, sooner or later, if you really committed to Marxism, you recognize that you got to go back, like Marx himself did in terms of Hegel's method, and reread and rethink things based on your rereading of some of this, fundamental material.
Sorry. Yep, George.
Okay, I would like to raise a question. First of all, there are many feminist strands. Okay, so I'm just going to focus on the strand that argues that housewives are unwaged labor that produces or reproduces the labor power of their husbands. Okay, so I want to ask the question: if they reproduce the labor power of their husband, who is reproducing their own labor power? How do they reproduce their own labor power? If they are producers, since they reproduce the labor power of their husbands, how do they reproduce their own labor power? That's the question I want to ask. Because if we investigate this question, try to find an answer, we will realize that they reproduce their own labor power out of the wage that her husband gets by being involved in the capitalist production process. So their husband pays them, pays their labor power. So there is no case of unwaged labor in the first place, and second, there is no case of exploitation by capitalism. This is simple logic. And if you accept the premise that women perform, housewives, sorry, not women, housewives perform unwaged labor, and the labor that they perform is to reproduce the labor power of their husbands. Let alone the pragmatic conditions that, for example, what happens in the case of the two-waged families? Because the housewives, as domestic participant, let's say, in the family unit, was a kind of trend, perhaps dominant till the 50s. But after the Second World War, and especially after the 70s, this ceases to exist. What we have dominant is the two-waged family, because capitalism does not want to have people outside of the production process. We know from Marx that he wants to increase the number of laborers as much as possible, involving them in the production process, because this is the only way that it can extract surplus value. Okay.
It's just such a big debate, George. I just feel like because I don't think we conceptualize. I don't think the culture conceptualizes the man's wage as he is paying her for that labor. Right? She isn't paid to have children. She's not paid to make him meals at night. She's not paid to do that work of reproduction. She might survive on his wage because that means she's dependent on his wage, doesn't it? That's the point.
Of course,
that she's dependent on his wage. So the work she does, she doesn't do that for any recompense. She does that for free, and that's how capital gets the labor much cheaper. Yeah.
Okay. Saying when they put the issue, the relationship into terms of payment, then we have to accept that it is a form of payment. In other words, the husband gives them some kind of allowance, let's say, for their personal expenses, and also pays for food for the family, pays the food for the children, and so on and so on. I contest, of course, the whole framework, but I'm saying I'm doing a kind of immanent critique now. Okay, immanent critique. I accept this premise, and I'm showing the irrationality.
I understand. Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, but Kenny,
Cynthia,
can I make a point?
wait.
I got Cynthia next. And then
I have
Wiley.
my hand up, I
Yeah, yep.
think.
Cynthia,
I'm
you
not
do. Cynthia, then Wiley. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
See, I mean, how to say, I have an immediate gut reaction to how incorrect the call for wages for housework is. I mean, because my immediate reaction is that's backwards. I mean, absolutely. We're looking for a world where people don't have to work for wages, where production is done for the sake of society, not for the sake of money. So it
Yeah.
it's I think what George has formulated is a very important consideration in terms of putting things in their correct relationships, because I mean, I'll just go on a little further. I have a little problem, like even in the way that Shane, we speak in Marxist terms of there's production and then there's the private labor of women, and I feel that the labor that humans do as a whole is part of the production process, of the social production process, and that it's incorrect to separate out quote unquote social reproduction as being in the home, and other production is real production. And that, to me, the language, how to say, undermines, in my opinion, Marx's real intent, which, as Shane said, he saw things becoming the activities of the home becoming social activities, and that really is what we've been looking at in terms of the earliest forms of relationships of raising children were very social, very, very social, and so. Um, Anyway, I think, okay, so I just want to say that I feel very uncomfortable with language that says, well, there's real labor and then there's the household labor. No, all labor in different forms. And that's what George is saying. I like that very much, what you said, George. And, it's not, I don't want us to be stuck in that formula because we got to move forward from it. But it is showing the whole relationship. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Uh,
just a second. Well, I absolutely agree with you, Cynthia, but I don't think that's the. I mean, I think there's all sorts of competition about that. I think that's right. It's about social reproduction, but I don't think Marxists have treated it that way. I think they have. I think Marxists is just as guilty of thinking as industrial production as real production, and
Right.
indeed of workers as workers in factories as real workers, as opposed to people working at home. But I think as Marxists, we should certainly think of it as social reproduction, including both. The spheres aren't separate, right? They're the same,
Right.
the dynamics are different. So I agree. Wiley, and then George, you've
yeah.
got your thing, so just
Okay.
conscious of
Well,
the time.
a couple of things. See, I think this last debate is an example of what I was trying to say earlier. Uh, let's begin the discussion, for example, by what Engels had to say on this question regarding the class struggle between the sexes. Let's talk about what he said about what's the position under the woman under this struggle with male supremacy. I think Engels says she was reduced to a slave. I think slavery was the operative term in terms of relationship with men and women under these conditions. The housewife is essentially a slave, under the property of the husband, more or less. And like most slaves, they get paid because you can't operate as a slave unless your substance survives so you can continue to live. But because people forget this, because people don't make an effort to disprove, no, Engels is wrong on that. The woman's not a slave. Unless you can disprove that, the rest of the discussion becomes hair splitting, hair splitting. I mean, deal with the question of disproving or proving or confirming or disconfirming what Engels has to say about the fundamental essential position of woman under male supremacy. Deal with that. And from that root, all these other questions tend to evaporate. And I'm not saying that there's not an ongoing class struggle on the part of women against that slavery. And I'm not saying that society in and of its own development moves against that primeval form into other forms. But that doesn't change the essence of the relationship. And that's what's fundamental. And once you lose that essence, then you up in the clouds dealing with numerous forms and arguing about what this form means, what that form means, totally detached from reality. And I think that so much of the debate takes that character.
Thanks, Wally. Just George, and then I'll put your slides up.
Two things. First of all, we should distinguish between two concepts, oppression and exploitation.
Yeah.
They are not identical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the history of patriarchy
But they're
and
interconnected.
the male
You
supremacy
can't
over
have
women,
exploitation
we are talking
without
about
But you can't, see, that's a
Huh?
separation thing again, George. You can't have exploitation without oppression. People don't voluntarily allow themselves to be exploited. So it's another false this dichotomy.
okay. Let me. You can make they are connected, but they are not identical. Okay, that's my point. And Engel's
And as
analysis
an opposition, they're in
focuses on oppression. He never uses the term exploitation. He's talking about domination and oppression.
Right.
And actually, he doesn't even talk about patriarchy. He's talking about how the males, men, succeeded to achieve supremacy over women. And of course, because I want to connect that with the point made by saying, this process took few millennia to establish itself. It's not a moment, or if you like, it's a moment that endured through thousands of years. Okay. And I will agree also with the idea, not necessarily of class struggle, but with the idea of struggles, because Engels is explicit that there was ongoing struggle that ended up in the supremacy of men over women. Okay. So it's not a kind of essentialized process that happened behind the back of the actors involved. But there is a difference between oppression and exploitation. And that is connected to my second point. We spent a whole month, discussing from the first volume of Theories of Surplus Value, what is productive and what is unproductive labor for Marx, for Adam Smith, and in general for the whole science of political economy. And it is explicit that productive labor is only the form of labor that produces surplus value. Okay? Not all kind of labors. Okay? Because even though, let me bracket it and say that I don't agree with the understanding of any form of social activity being seen as labor. Okay. I don't think that labor is such an expansive category that covers up every form of social activity. And I would even say that the very concept of labor will end in socialism and capitalism, or at least in communism. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay? And then we will have free social activities in various forms, but not labor. Labor somehow suggests the idea of dependency and the determinacy of material needs, that you have to work on matter in order to reproduce yourself or the community within which someone is. Okay, so I make this kind of exception. But let us say that this is my own personal theoretical understanding concerning the idea of labor. Okay, but never. What I want to question, and I really disagree radically, is the use of Marxism by feminism and the destruction of the idea of productive labor, that it is the basis for the whole theory of labor theory of value. In a way, it is an attack against Marxism, or at least against Marxist theory, when you deny the labor theory of value by generalizing, broadening up the very idea of production. Because for Marx, production is production of surplus value. This is the hidden secret that brings forward exploitation. Otherwise, you don't have exploitation. You have the usual bourgeois apology of, you know, the partners in the production process contribute equally or in different degrees to the whole product and to the value of the commodities. So, inadvertently, perhaps, feminists, exactly because they don't know what is Marxist theory, destroy Marxist theory. And nevertheless, they invoke a kind of identification that we are Marxist, we are socialist feminists by using all this kind of arguments. And actually, if you read Federici, which the one I have read, she begins in the introduction by criticizing Marx, why Marx is wrong. Okay. And if you read other texts also by feminists, socialist feminists, Marxist feminists, or what have you, they already make comments why Marx was wrong, why he didn't understand their own viewpoint, let's say half a century or a century earlier, and they try to correct him, to bring the true rectitude, how Marx should have seen the utility and the contribution of labor contribution and exploitation in the domestic field. But this is completely irrelevant, if you like, to Marxist theory. And the second also, that I disagree, and same touched on that, is the very idea of social reproduction. I mean, the second volume of Capital is based on the idea of social reproduction. It has nothing to do with the domestic sphere. It has to do with the total social capital and how this circulates from the production sphere
and the people producing babies, and that's got nothing to do with it, right? Like that, yeah, okay. The total social capital has got nothing to do with anyone having babies or anything. Like, come on.
Exactly.
The workforce just spontaneously generates or something. Wally, come on. Well, I'm just trying to give George. Sorry, I'm just trying to give George. He's got to do his slides before we go. So just
Right. Let me just make one quick comment, because I'm sorry to get out of the box, but I feel very strongly about this. See, that's another thing. You cannot, and I'll repeat it, and I'm fine. You cannot, what George just did, you can't do. You can't say there's identity between oppression and exploitation, but then there's no contradiction. Exploitation breeds oppression. Okay, we must begin with that. Secondly, I think it's very important. Lord, I lost my point, and the most important one. Oh, on this question of labor, George is wrong. What does Marx say about communism? What did Marx mean by labor is life's prime want? There's nothing
can you repeat that?
negative about labor. Yeah. If I'm understanding correctly, there's nothing negative about labor. Is labor's life's prime want. We misunderstand labor because we look at labor from this exploitative kind of activity. We engage under these exploitative systems like capitalism. Labor is creative activity. It's the expression of our lives as human beings. It's what makes us human. Remember Engel's point, the part played by labor. I mean, in the transition from ape to man. That's what distinguishes our ability to change the world through our interaction with that world objectively and subjectively. And that's why I keep going back to this chapter 2. Because we don't digest and marinate those basic concepts, we miss it. And we come up with things that just don't make sense when you think about it. I'm sorry, but I gotta, this has been a long thing. If you just make mistake after mistake because we forget about the fundamentals of Marxism, the class struggle, the forms of the class struggle. Engels is correct. I mean, somebody's got to prove Engels wrong in terms of the origin of the class struggle. And from that, the emergence of private property, and also from that, the emergence of the state as a solution to the reality of the class struggle or society being divided against itself, all the way down to the sexes. I mean, you just can't avoid those fundamental principles because they reflect the reality of social life. And yeah, it challenges us, and I'm not saying for a moment, and I really appreciate what Shane did in his initial thing, because he takes us through and at least exposes some of these major contradictions that emerges from these honest efforts by these investigators to really search for the truth. But I don't care how honest you are, if you don't have the proper method and the proper theory, it's going to be very difficult to really get to the truth. And and that's the struggle that I think we're confronted with today. I'm sorry for the long period, but I feel very strongly about it.
It's all good, Wally. Cynthia.
Okay, I'm just commenting on George, and just I I kind of feel like what I said sounded like the feminists, but I don't like the feminists at all. No, I mean I hate it that the women who are arguing on behalf of women are destroying Marxism. I mean, I can't deal with that. I just can't deal with it. And so I agree with what you're saying, George. And I do think that I think that Wiley got to the essence of what I was trying to say, in that the Marx that I embrace starts from the fact, as Wiley said, that all labor is part of the development of human society, right, in whatever form it is. And that what happens, and I hear this in what you were saying, George, is that we begin to describe it only as if the labor is the labor of that is relevant under capitalism. And that of course is the labor that produces surplus value. But what I was arguing against is the language that restricts the idea of labor to just that which produces social with surplus value. And so we could say, some people say, well, you should use the term work then, if that will reserve labor for production of surplus value and the rest. No, to me, like as Wiley says, the honest activity of humans is the labor that produces our society in its whatever social relations exist at whatever time, and that we're able to develop, and that anyway, so I just want to put up an argument for that, while at the same time agreeing with you that the destruction of Marxism by the feminists is really a very, very serious error, and has set back the social movement for decades, maybe a century. I don't know when it all began. But anyway, that's my rant.
Okay, George, just
Okay,
conscious of the time, George. That's all. If you're going to get your slides in.
Okay. Let me introduce a distinction that we know, but maybe will clarify some of the issues that we contend about. The distinction between production, for example, and the social form of production, which is the specific historical form under which production takes place, that differentiates. The same applies to labor. I will agree with the idea that labor without qualification, if you like, outside of any kind of specific social form, is a necessary activity coincident with the very possibility of producing and reproducing our social life. Okay, in that sense. But actually, we know from Marx that labor always exists under specific social forms, historical forms. The form of labor in feudalism is different from the form of labor in capitalism. It is different from the form of labor in slave-owning modes of production.
Mm-hmm.
If we forget about that and we just talk about labor, we destroy the whole Marxist theory of history and the distinction between modes of production, which organizes the whole understanding of human history. So we have to be careful with abstractions. Okay, labor as an abstraction without qualifications, in other words, without its specific social form, is at the basis. It's an ontological category, if you like, a social ontological category. But it always exists under a specific socio-historical form, and that distinguishes it from other forms of labor. Otherwise, we would just talk about one relationship. And Marx is very explicit. He says, for example, that the form of exploitation, of labor exploitation in a slave-owning mode of production and in feudalism has a commonality, which is that it is based on personal dependence. And the laborers know that they contribute this surplus labor to their exploiters. Okay. And this has a qualitative difference from the form, from the social form of the relationship of labor giving in capitalism, because the wage relationship mystifies, hides this kind of offer or extraction of surplus labor. Okay. So the specificity of the social form is very important, because in the previous modes of production, it was transparent, okay? But in capitalism, and this is what concerns us, because we care about emancipation, liberation, and the overcoming of this type of system, the specific social form of labor, of surplus labor, is hidden by the wage form. Okay? And that misleads, if you like, the working class in terms of its demand, because very often, not that I reject them, don't misinterpret them, but they say that let's raise our wages, not abolish the wage relationship. Okay, the dominant demand of working classes throughout the world is how you can increase the wage that they receive out of the production process from their employees, from the capital. Okay, it's not how to abolish the wage form relationship. But this is due to the fact of the mystification. So we should be very careful not to close our eyes to the socio-historical specificity of the social forms, whether we talk about labor or production or other type of activities. And the same applies also to the family. Let me connect it with Engels' analysis. And that was my criticism of John, when he criticized Engels because he uses the term family as if family is one and the same thing throughout the human history. But and Engels is explicit that we are talking about quite different and opposite even forms. It's not that we have one label family, and this is the same in the prehistory and the same in the Roman period and so on. Okay. So we have to be careful about the historicity of concepts, of terms, and of the relationships.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so I will put George's slides up and try to keep up with him as he goes through them. If that, hopefully this will work.
In the previous presentation, I raised the question that it is very important, in my view, and I think we can understand because of its character. And I said, there is an issue. How can or how did it happen that private property emerged within the context of communities, primitive communist forms of community, which were based on communal property? In other words, how can you have the emergence of private property within a society, not society, a community, tribal forms of organization that are communal, that are based on communal property, communal forms of property? So I thought up the answer, if you like, in the period today. So my solution to the mystery of how private property originated within communities organized on the basis of communal property is the following. But I take Marx's fundamental distinction from the Grundrisse, where he says that the real aspect in order to understand property is possession, okay? Effective possession.
Yep.
And he produces the distinction between possession and property in the Grundrisse. So I start from that, where Marx says that effective product possession leads to property as its legalized form. And I connect that with the institution of usufruct.
George, for some reason I can't hear you very well, and I can't read it because it's smaller than my eyes can see.
Yeah,
Can you speak more clearly into the microphone?
Yes, I'll try to.
I'm sorry. It's just I really want to hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I'm not reading out of the slides.
No. Oh, okay.
I'm reading out of my notes.
Okay.
And I'm giving a response, my personal response, my solution to the mystery of how private property emerged within the context, the social context, the communal context of tribes organized on the basis of communal property. Now,
right.
How did it happen? Okay, so I'm saying that we have to use the distinction between possession and property that Marx introduces in the Grundrisse by saying that the real issue and the importance is who possesses something.
Yeah.
And property comes later as a legalized form of this possession, effective possession of something. And I connect that process with the institution of usufruct, which is an institution where the state, let's say, recognizes to peasants who have been using land without owning this land for many years and in a customary way, and after a certain period of time recognizes because of use that they really own the land, the piece of land. Okay, this is called usufruct. Usufruct. Okay, so my argument is that we have a kind of continuous use within these tribal communities, continuous use of an implement, of an animal, of a place, of an abode, of a tool, and that continuous use created a condition of appropriation such that habituates the user of the object and turns him into a permanent owner. So this is a kind of relationship out of continuous use of the same object, tool, animal, and so on, that establishes a kind of relation of appropriation. And this relationship is being socially recognized by the rest of the tribe, by the other persons, as if the user has personal rights over the object. So, my argument is that private property emerges from repetitive use, leading to possession, leading to exclusive use, leading to private property, leading to recognized power to bequeath it to progeny, because the whole issue also, in terms of the Engelsian argument, is how men succeeded to transfer their property to their own kids, to their progeny. Because in the beginning there was the matrilineal organization of the tribes, and the whole struggle between men and women, especially of men over women, is how to transfer property from the matrilineal line of descent to the patrilineal line of descent. And this is the shift change that establishes patriarchy, actually. Okay. And then we have succession of generation on the basis of inheritance of property and the establishment of the house, of the patriarchal house, that appears in the last stage of barbarism, which is the Homeric period. Engels calls it the heroic period. Okay, so that's my solution. I don't know if there are other solutions, but that's my solution of how private property has emerged. Also, I should add to include the element of labor, because when you are a continuous user or a kind of permanent user of an object and implement, it means that you also maintain it, you reproduce it, you invest labor in it. And we know from the Lockean theory of appropriation of property through labor, that this is a very widespread relationship. If someone puts labor or something by throughout a significant period of time, more or less, even if this is communal, it ends up being private or personal, if you like, as a form of appropriation. Okay, so this is my explanation. I would like to hear if there are alternative ways of explaining the emergence of private property.
I have a comment.
Go on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yep, you go.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the process, namely the movement, certainly the factor of possession and the practice of possession. But the other thing I would argue, again, referring back to Engels, is the development of productive forces itself, i.e., as certain productive forces become more dominant, more predominant, namely cattle, and the work and labor associated with that evolving mode of production, is such the conditions for the things that George is talking about. Because none of this happens with the previous level of development of productive forces. And the same thing occurs or accrues to under the matriarchy, when the forces of production stood at a level which led to the control and possession of those means by women and so forth. So again, we're in agreement, but the substrate of that, the substrate of the process that George is talking about, is dependent upon the level of development of productive forces. It's that which makes that further development and that further property relations possible.
I agree, Willie. I agree that the development of the productive forces, or at least the development of the productive activity itself, and the implements that they use, and the foods that they were creating, and the cattle. Of course, the domestication of animal is fundamental in the cattle, but still, Engels is explicit on that. This emergence of private property precedes the development of the social division of labor. In other words, you don't have private ownership because first you have a social division of labor that allocates specific tasks to women and other tasks to men, and on that basis, they start owning, let's say, the particular domain of activity that they control. We don't have the precedence of the social division of labor before the emergence of private property. So we have to respond to the question. Okay, you have those domestication of animals, and that means cattle. Okay, but cattle, why should cattle become private property? Since everything in that tribe within which these animals become domesticated are already communal property. Okay? So it's not exactly the necessity of having greater and more expansive forms of productive forces, but it is that the generation of productive forces which are communally used exactly because of this continuous use by certain producers, develop this kind of association and private appropriation of the animal or of the tool or of the implement and so on, that gives birth to personal property, actually. We wouldn't say yet, or personal possession rather than property in the strict sense, since legalization or legal acknowledgement of the owner comes later and presupposes, first of all, the state. Okay, and we don't have state yet. We are talking about a period in human history that the state has not been born. We do have political relationship, we have institutions of political power, which are egalitarian and democratic. Engels even calls it primitive democracy. This is very important. He calls these tribal communities primitive democracy. But we don't have a state. We need to have the state that will legalize forms of private property. So till then, we have forms, if you like, of exclusive possession. And this then generates social division of labor. Okay? And makes women, let's say, start working exclusively in weaving and preparing food and doing this kind of activities. Then you have this kind of division. Because if cattle, for example, have become private possession, then it becomes the specific task by men. And that allows exclusivity, creates fears. When someone owns something exclusively, it means that it creates a sphere, a border, a symbolic social border that does not allow others outside of this border of using or appropriating the object owned and possessed by the person who possesses. Okay, so we have a kind of symbolic and social and material division of societies into spheres through the idea of exclusive possession. Okay, and this helped the separation of the domestic sphere from the public sphere, because tending cattle is a public activity. It takes place in the open, on the open terrain. You don't have the cattle into the into the household. So this kind of division, this kind of emergence of exclusive possession established also gradually the division between the public and the private, the division between the open work, open labor on the fields, if you like, and work within the household. And that became a kind of division between male and female, and established the supremacy, started to establish the supremacy of men over women. Because owning or possessing the domesticated animals, which is the most important source of power for production also, because it started to introduce, it helped introduce also agricultural production. Don't forget that these communities that we are talking about are nomadic communities in a certain sense, because the dominant mode of production is hunting and gathering. Okay, so we have, through the domestication of animals, we have the transition to sedentary, to a kind of sedentary material form of production, agriculture, and so on. And agriculture is in the open fields. Okay, so men started to take control, if you like, of the production process, not as a private individuals, as a communal body, but as a particular communal body within the overall community. Okay, and that helped strengthen, reinforced the social division of labor, putting women into the domestic household. And from there on, this division was consolidated, crystallized, ossified, if you like, through the passage of centuries, of many centuries. Okay, this didn't happen in a decade or in a year or something like that. Okay. And of course, it happened through struggles also, because women wouldn't like to feel, to be, dependent on men as much, since they lost their freedom. They had the freedom. They were on an equal basis with men beforehand. Okay. But also we do have changes in the kinship system, and the kinship system was fundamental. It was not something particular outside of the economy. There was no economy. Everything is combined. It's a compound. It's a mixed structure. It is us who see the differentiation of the economy from law, from the household, from the ideological sphere, from the political sphere, that we project back into that society, this kind of distinctions. Everything was one mess, social mess, if you like, controlled under the kinship system. The kinship system regulates the exchanges and the social relationships between men and women, the parents and children, the political relationships, because political representation in the institutions of power was based on the genders, which are kinship groups, okay, and so on.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Wally, yeah.
Yeah, can I make a comment? Yeah, Shane, I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, you go, Wally. Yeah, I assumed George wasn't speaking to his slides, so I took them down. So,
Okay.
Wally, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment on the last point that George made. And I'm agreeing, but I'm just trying to add in elements that I think are important, because what he describes in terms of division labor is important, but the element is important, and I typically place a lot of stress on this element. And this element is that with each successive progressive stage in the development of the productive forces, it certainly leads to changes in the form of the family and of society and organization society generally. But it also leads in the development of the ability of the group of humankind to produce a surplus. Okay. And that's fundamental because, for example, as Ingles points out, during the period of so-called matriarchy, and we use that, that the level of development of the productive forces did not allow for the development of a sufficient surplus, or
Yes.
other than that, to meet immediate consumption needs, more or less, if I'm reading English correctly. But it was with the development of cattle raising and the activity associated with that, which led to a substantial development of surplus, and also led to development of the emergence of the concept of property in the real sense. Because property is essentially accumulated wealth and the claim on that wealth. Okay. So that we have to say that coincident with the overthrow of mother rights, so to speak, was the level of development of productive forces, which at the same time made the emergence of private property a significant variable, a significant determinant of everything else. So I think it's important to also keep in mind that every step forward also meant the increased humankind being able to put greater distance between itself and the utter immediate dependence upon nature. That as we progress as a species, as a social species, that we also can be to put distance between ourselves and immediate want. That our productive powers allowed us to produce a surplus, which simply means we can live without having to fight for our existence every day. And that sets in motion other things that lead to the basis for development, such as private property, inheritance rights, and so forth. So I just wanted to add that because I think that division of labor, all those things are important, but the resultant of those things is the production of a surplus product.
I absolutely agree with you. Surplus is the most important thing because surplus means that we leave the state of a mode of production that is based on simple reproduction. This is the idea of surplus means that we start to have expanded reproduction, regardless of who appropriates the surplus or not. And Engels introduces a very ingenious idea that I was really surprised to read it. He said, you cannot have the institution of slavery born in history if you don't have a society that already produces surplus. You have first the production of surplus, the possibility of production of surplus, and then slavery. Why? There is no logic in having slaves if their cost of reproduction is exactly the same without their own ability to produce surplus. Why should you have slaves then in such society? You cannot maintain them. They are not going to produce any surplus. You need to have a society that produces surplus so you can capture, because slaves were prisoners of war, were not commodities. Later they became commodities of sale and purchase. In the beginning, they were prisoners of war. But you need to have a society that produces surplus so you can have prisoners of war use the slaves to produce surplus. And of course, accumulate private property. Before that, in societies or in communities that are based on simple reproduction, there is no use of the institution of slavery. So it was invented, Engels says, invented after the possibility of surplus production was introduced in the communities, in these communities. And guys, I have to leave. I have to leave in few minutes. So if you want to ask me something, or I don't know. Okay.
Well, Cynthia, I just want to say thank you for um, the clarity with which you explained the the stages of the development of private property out of communal property. I thought that was extremely useful. Thank you.
They were just your notes, were they, George? You don't have anything you want me to send out with the
Okay,
with the
okay.
usual email, or I can just make a script out of what you just said, or I just thought if
Yes,
you had your notes there, I could
yeah.
whatever.
Possibly some material out of the script of the
Okay,
presentation
okay,
because
I've
I
got
didn't read out of my.
okay. That's all right. I'll do that and put it around.
Thank
Sorry to
you.
Hey,
leave you,
George,
but
take care.
See you next week.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm in a hurry.
Discussion, discussion, yeah, yeah. Wow. Mm. Woo.
Yeah, I feel a bit the same, Wally. That was a vigorous discussion.
Yeah,
It
it
was
was
good. Yeah,
very
it
good.
was good.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Sometimes I lose it. You're my old friend. I'm
No,
a forget
no,
that.
no, it's good. It's good. I think there's.
Yeah, yeah. Uh,
I think
I'm going to go
we
back and yeah. I'm going to definitely revisit that Anthony Davis piece.
hmm,
I don't want to, you know, I have an appreciation for the struggle, the feminist struggle. I really do, and I have to admit I have not given that area the attention that it needs because I'm very sympathetic to what the fight's about, you know. But it's I want to be able to approach it with an open mind and a very supportive way. The other thing, just very quickly, um, somehow at some point we really need to discuss uh, the place and role of the proletarian woman. And when I say proletarian, I mean it in terms of women that I grew up with, as myself, my own experience. Um, because it's very enlightening in terms of looking at it, that struggle from the day-to-day standpoint. Ingalls was certainly correct in terms of his characterization, but life is very difficult for the proletarian woman under capitalism. Extremely difficult. I mean, she catches hell from every angle. And the literature and everything doesn't give enough consideration for his heroic struggle these women wage on a day-to-day basis in behalf of themselves, their mates, and their children. And somehow we got to really address that question.
yeah. I've been trying to. Oh, sorry, Cynthia, you go.
Actually, I want to speak to what Wiley's been saying, if that's okay.
No, no, you go.
Um, First of all, what's really missing from this, well, is the sense that, how do I say, a lack of recognition of the power that women have. I mean, it's really distressing to me to hear that women can't do this, can't do that, but they're restricted, they're enslaved. I don't agree with that. I don't think women are slaves. I think I think men don't realize to what extent women actually control the life of men. And I really think that's true. You're all talking as if you don't understand that behind every man there is a woman controlling you. I mean, you just don't know that. And you can talk as if you think, as if it's true, but it's, I mean, not true, as if you're in control. But the only thing that puts you in control are the laws of capitalism, the laws of the state of capitalism. And that the essential relationship is one where men and women are equal in terms of their contribution to society and in terms of their intellectual capabilities. And really, in that sense, women have more of a role than men because women are the ones who have the primary responsibility for setting the children, preparing the children for their adulthood, so that the continual development of a labor a skilled labor force is primarily it has, both men and women have roles, but the first and primary relationship is women, the nurturing, the health, and the education of the children. So I feel I'm just gonna, I mean, this is, I really, in this sense, I'm speaking as a woman, that it's very difficult to participate and hear men talk about women not having power when in fact we have tremendous power and it needs to be recognized what it is. Now, and so, yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. And and I don't agree that women are exploited by men. I think the whole idea of the class struggle between men and women is wrong. And I think I don't agree with Wiley on that. I think the feminists have, like I said before, they've set back the struggle for society as a whole, and women in particular, by their formulation that men are the problem. Anything having to do with what we call male supremacy and the ideology of it, the women carry just as much, if not more, than the men. I mean, I think men are willing to give up male supremacy before women are. And it's a very, very complex relationship, but every woman that I know carries within her an acceptance of male supremacy alongside of her understanding of her own whatever she is capable of doing. Anyway, just my little rant in opposition to some of the rants that were given before. Sorry, guys.
No, not
Where's
at all.
Jennifer?
I'm gonna let her have the last word on that one. I'm not.
Okay. Okay, Wiley, that's good. That's good. It's been a good discussion.
Right. Okay.
Jennifer did make some various comments in the chat, but she seems to have left. But so
Okay.
I will see if I can turn those into a post for the email or something. And
Okay, thank you. That would be helpful. Yeah.
next we will go to next week's the state, last bit of the puzzle, right? Family, private property, and the state. So, and I've
Okay.
framed that a little bit around
Thank you so much.
our
Thank you.
previous discussion about transcending the state, right? So, so that'll set us up for the last one. Oh, yeah, sorry.
So, thank you, Shane, for organizing us so well. Thank you.
No worries. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Okay.